Chapter 5 Going Home. By the second week of April, the sap had ceased to run, but it had been a good sugaring season. The mistress decided to take a large selection of the molded maple sugar to Boston. She could pay for her trip by selling the sugar, and it would give her a chance to see the big city and her perpetually ailing sister. Work did not disappear with the departure of the mistress, but it became as pleasant as a holiday. If I could make life so happy for others just by going away, I'd go more often, Tryphena said. In 2 weeks, Lyddie and Tryphena and Willie, when they could catch him, turned the huge house inside out with scrubbing and cleaning. It smelled as good as the air of coming spring. And though there was a bit of fresh snow toward the end of the month, Lyddie knew it for the sham winter it was. Spring could not be denied forever. "Well," said the cook one night, "the mistress earned herself a trip. I think the rest of us have too." "Where will you go, eh?" asked Lyddie wistfully. "Me?" Tryphena said. She was knitting, and her worn red hands fairly flown over the yarn. "I got no place I want to visit. I've been to Montpelier twice. That's enough. Boston's too big and too dirty. I wouldn't like it. Where would you go?" "Home," said Lyddie, her voice no more than a whisper. "Home? But that's hardly 10 miles." Lyddie nodded. "It might as well be 10,000. You can go and be back in no more than a couple days at most." What was the woman saying? "Go on, tomorrow if you like." Lyddie couldn't believe her ears. "But who's going to care with the mistress gone?" She turned the row and began to purl without even looking down. "Would it be all right?" "If I say so," Tryphena said. "With her gone, I'm in charge, eh?" Lyddie wasn't going to argue. "If you was to wait, the ground would thaw to mud. Better go tomorrow if it's fair. Take a little sugar to your brother on the way." Lyddie opened her mouth to ask again if it would be all right, but decided not to. If Tryphena said she could go, who was Lyddie to question? She was up before the sun, but she could tell that the day would be a good one. She took a lunch bucket of bread and cheese and a little packet of molded sugar. The snow in the roadway was already turning to mud, and she slung a pair of snowshoes on her back in case the tracks up the mountain were still deep in snow. She reached the mill in less than an hour, but to her disappointment, Charlie was not there. "I think if he's off somewheres," one of the men said. "But you can ask up at the house." A pretty, rather plump woman answered Lyddie's knock. "Yes," she said, but she was smiling. "I come to see Charles Worthen." Lyddie seemed to stumble over the words, which made her flush with embarrassment. "I'm his sister." "Of course," the woman said. "Come in." Lyddie stopped to leave her snowshoes and lunch bucket on the porch, then followed the woman into a large, fragrant kitchen. "I was just starting dinner," the woman said, as if in apology, as she hurried to stir the stew bubbling over the fire in the stone fireplace. "Charles is at school today." She replaced the lid on the kettle. "He's a very bright boy." "Yes," said Lyddie. She would not be envious of Charlie. They were nearly the same person, weren't they? "My husband is growing very fond of him." What does she mean? Who was growing fond of Charlie? Charlie was not their child, not even their apprentice. She felt a need to explain to the woman that Charlie belonged to her, but she couldn't figure out how. Just tell him I was here, eh?" she said awkwardly. At the door, she remembered the sugar and shoved it at the woman. "Some sugar," she mumbled. "We'd be happy for you to stay a while," the woman said, but Lyddie was already picking up her things. "I have to go," she said. "Not much time." She realized later that she'd forgotten to say thank you, but there was no going back. Besides, she was in a hurry to get to the farm. She'd have time to clean the house well and check the roofs, as well as find a good place to hide the money. She'd just spend the night there, as it would be almost dark by the time she got everything done. If she got an early start the next day, perhaps she could stop by once more at the mill. But no, she couldn't stop by again and ask for Charlie and have him at school again. What would they think of her? And it might embarrass Charlie to have his sister clucking over him like an old biddy hen. She couldn't stand the thought of Charlie being mortified by her in front of the people who thought so highly of him. Well, she was glad. Hadn't she felt bad that he didn't have a father and a mother like Luke Stevens had to watch over him? But these weren't his real family. She was his real family, more than their mother, really, who had shuckled them off like corn husks to follow her craziness. Her anger, or whatever emotion it was that kept her reeling, kept her feet moving as well. She was walking past the Stevens' farm by noon. She never stopped to eat, but on the last leg of the trip she suddenly realized her hunger and chewed on the now hard roll and dry cheese as she climbed the narrow track toward the farm. There was still plenty of snow on the track, but it was better packed than she had imagined. Mr. Wescott must be going back and forth to see his cows, and then she realized there was snow on the pastures. There'd be no animals up in the fields, but of course the sugaring. He had gone back and forth gathering sap from the sugar bush. When she rounded the bend, she half expected the cabin to have disappeared. But there it sat, sagging a bit, squat and honest as her father had built it. The firewood was stacked against the door as she and Charlie had left it. The roof seemed undamaged from the snow, thanks perhaps to Luke Stevens. Those must be his tracks around the cabin. She felt kindly toward the tall, awkward young Quaker for taking care. She fetched the short ladder from the shed and propped it against one of the two south windows. Then she fetched a piece of split wood from the pile at the front door. The window should be easy to pry open unless it had swollen, but it hadn't. Indeed, it seemed to open quite smoothly, as though welcoming her home. Lyddie propped it up with the wood. She put her right leg over the sill and scrunched her head down into the chest to squeeze it into the opening. Then she saw it at the fireplace, a shadowy form. She stifled and screamed. "Luke!" she whispered. "That you?" The form turned and stood up. She could barely make it out in the gloom of the cabin, but it was a tall man, not Luke. There was a strange man in her home. The whites of his eyes seemed enormous. And then she realized what was so strange about him. In the dim light, his face and hands were very dark. Only his eyes shone. She was looking at a black man.